Hello and welcome to Security Scan. I am Uday Bhaskar. This week we look at the London terror attack of March 22nd, wherein 5 people were killed, including the attacker, a British citizen, Khalid Masood, earlier known by the name Adrian Elms. The nature of the attack was similar to what happened in Europe last year, namely the use of automobiles being driven at high speed and deliberately mowing down innocent pedestrians. In this case, the attacker tried to crash his vehicle into the fence around Westminster Palace, thereby triggering a close down of the British Parliament. Masood knifed a policeman who died, and finally armed security personnel were able to neutralize the attacker. The Islamic State claimed responsibility, but perhaps more for having encouraged and inspired this attack as opposed to planning it and activating sleeper cells for this purpose. Many questions arise again, given that it was on March 22nd, 2016, last year, that Belgium was the target of a terror attack. And on July 14th last, Nice in France was the target of a cargo truck driven by a Tunisian resident in France that killed 88 innocents. Berlin was next, when a truck was driven into a Christmas crowd in December last. It's a long list. But is this the new normal? Such premeditated terror strikes by lone perpetrators in Europe and other parts of the world? Is even greater surveillance and more stringent cyber protocols the way ahead? How did the media cover these attacks? And what is the appropriate manner of reporting terror attacks of this nature? And what does this pattern and the post-attack claims by the Islamic State mean for India? To discuss these issues, we have an eminent panel. Allow me to welcome and introduce Mr. Praveen Swami, Strategic Affairs Editor of the Indian Express, who has been writing on these issues for a very long time. Ms. Sharma Dua, who is currently a visiting scholar at the Subu Forum. And Colonel Vivek Chadha, Research Fellow at the Institute for Defence Studies and Analysis. Let me turn to you first, Mr. Swami. You've written extensively, most recently, about the London terror attack. How would you characterize this as, in terms of the pattern that we have seen before this and perhaps some that may follow?
This one, I think, is actually tells us something that we've known a long time, that there are large numbers of individuals who are deeply hostile to the countries where they're staying, to the policies of those countries, but don't have any sort of access to training or to resources that for carrying out a terror act of any real substance. Also individuals who are completely alienated from their communities and who arguably are on the fringes between being, if you like, political actors and individuals with psychopathological problems, who are moved to acts of extreme violence to try and make a point as much as to act on a political agenda. We've seen 6, by my count, 5 or 6 terrorist attacks of this kind foiled just in the UK since 2013. And sadly, as long as we have intense political conflicts unfolding in West Asia and elsewhere in the world, we probably will have incidents like this from time to time being successful. It's simply impossible for any police service, no matter how intrusive intelligence work gets, to block every disgruntled individual from doing something. Even making a crude bomb or a crude explosive device, the technology is not very great. You can download instructions for these things off the internet. My guess is that we'll have to get used to doing it, to living with this. And let's also look at the fact that despite all the enormous publicity these incidents get, the damage they cause is not very much. I mean, this individual, while the losses of lives are very great for the individuals concerned, this individual did not inflict any damage that a traffic accident wouldn't on a given day. And I think part of dealing with these things is going to be us learning to deal with these instances in a mature way.
I think we'll come back to this later about whether a traffic accident, deaths due to traffic accidents and those by terror violence should be on the same scale. But I'll come back to that later. Let me, you made a point about publicity. Ms. Dua, if I could ask you, you are a French national and you have also studied in the UK. And I would say that in many ways now you're a global citizen because you spent time in India, you know Britain, you've been in France and so on. How would you characterize the reporting of terror incidents? You know France very well. Yes. And you've been tracking London as a student of international relations. So could you share with us your views now as a global citizen?
Yes, so, I believe there's a big difference between the way France or the UK actually deal with the media coverage of these incidents. The UK coverage is a lot more cautious. For example, the name of the suspect wasn't released before the police formally did it. And he was treated as a man from Kent who went wrong in life, took the wrong path, petty criminal, and was sort of bound to do this. The focus is not on the ideology. In France, it's very different. The focus is on the ideology. For example, in Nice, the man was treated mainly as a Muslim when his family was claiming that he was a schizophrenic, that he had problems, that he was far removed from Islam. So these are two very different treatments. Another one is the UK is very much focused on the heroic part and trying to be positive, that the police acted really well and reacted well to the situation and was prepared. Whereas in France, the question was, what was the failure? How could this happen? Why wasn't this stopped? And saying this inherently politicizes the problem, because it's like bringing a mic to politicians and saying, what will you do better? Whereas the UK tried to be non-political and bring people together and go back to normality as quick as possible. Now, why this difference? I believe it is first because France is not used to these attacks and is reacting in a sort of emotional way to something it's not used to. There's also a state of emergency, which is costly in funds, but also in freedoms. So you have this need to legitimize what's going on with the fact there's a constant threat of something happening and happening again in France. But in the UK, something else is the link to the US and the scare of fake news. So media is going to be a lot more careful of what it says, because the backlash could be enormous.
I think that's a very interesting kind of contrast between France and Britain. But Colonel Chadha, if I could bring you in here, you're familiar with the Indian coverage. We go back really to Mumbai of 2008, and there was, I would say, a hope that lessons would be learned. But I would say, alas, no. I mean, this is my sense personally, that I don't think the Indian audiovisual medium in particular has been able to arrive at that index of a measured response where you are accurate and you report without getting into other aspects of quote-unquote editorializing. So how would you characterize, A, the Indian response, and what is it about London that you think may have some strands or cues that we should look at?
Well, I would not like to paint the entire media coverage in India with the same brush. We have a journalist sitting here on the panel.
I'm going to ask Praveen shortly.
So I would not like to do that. And let me say what I'm going to say, he is one of the exceptions. But I think most cases that we see, and especially on the audiovisual medium, given the fact that it's near instantaneous, it tends to get impetuous. It is very often immature and is again very often ill-informed. Now, the problem that seems to be arising is the acute desire to come to a conclusion at the end of that half-an-hour program. It's very difficult to imagine that when security forces have still now made an analysis of the incident in terms of who the perpetrators are, what are the exact numbers, what is the intent. Here we have channels who've actually come to these conclusions in a bulleted format at the end of the program. And I think the second thing that comes about is probably, again, it's a cultural issue. There's a joke which is often told that, if 9/11 had happened in India, instead of running away from the site of incident, people would have been running toward the site of the incident to see what had happened. So this inherent desire to be a part of the tamasha is what the audio-visual medium seem to be characterizing the best. And I think in terms of a comparison, probably it's closer to the French example than to the British. Since you asked for a comparison, I think the British example here reflected maturity at a variety of levels. There was maturity at the political level, there was maturity at the level of the common citizen, and there was of course maturity at the level of the media. And I think there are lessons that we need to take from there.
You know, that's an interesting point you make about the cultural factor. But Praveen, you are a journalist of great eminence and experience. You actually worked in Britain. But interestingly, as far as the London terror attack is concerned, there were many voices in Britain that were very critical actually of the way in which British television, BBC in particular, had dealt with this. And I think it was Simon Jenkins who wrote about this, saying that it was needlessly emotional. Now, this, as I said, is quite in contrast to the larger perception that there was a measured response. And I suppose looking at India, this seems to be the... Can you help us to place this in perspective? Why I'm asking you to do this is, way back you remember when we had Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher, she used to say in relation to terrorism, and this was the IRA, the Irish Republican Army at that time, that the media and the audiovisual particularly is the oxygen for the terrorist. So you turn that off and in many ways you are quarantining it. So now in 2017, how would you characterize it?
The oxygen of publicity argument. Look, I mean, one doesn't want to romanticize the UK model. So we had Channel 4, for example, getting the name of the perpetrator wrong. News channels will be competitive about getting information out to their audiences. Mistakes will occasionally be made. And if news platforms are honest about their mistakes and come out and say, look, we made mistakes, we goofed up, I don't necessarily have a problem with this. In fairness, I mean, you know, Colonel Chadha's point is very well taken. There's a lot of immaturity, a lot of hysteria, a lot of rumor mongering that goes on in Indian media coverage, and that criticism is well taken. Having said that, there's a lot of immaturity and rumor mongering that comes out from officialdom as well. In the recent case we had of the shootout in Lucknow, for example, some of the worst offenders weren't the media, but statements that were coming out from high officials in Uttar Pradesh and in Madhya Pradesh. And the institution of the official spokesperson isn't a particularly well developed and, let us say, necessarily trustworthy institution in India, for which there are many, you know, historical reasons. And until that institution becomes a mature and credible institution, this problem is going to persist. When there is a vacuum of credible, reliable information, something or the other is going to sort of fill that bubble in. And I think this is where government, when it points fingers at the media, doesn't realize there's another half to the story. You can shut the media up, or you can put pressure, for a certain kind of coverage. But till the government has its own act together and becomes a reliable and transparent purveyor of information that is accepted to be credible, nothing is going to work.
You know, but in this day and age, I don't know that it's even an option to try and keep the media either down or out, because today every citizen is a journalist. I mean, you have a cell phone, you're automatically disseminating. But Vivek, I want to bring you in on this. What Praveen says is very, very something that has been, you know, identified in the past, but we have not seemed to have an institutional response, which is, you're an army officer, you served in the Northeast, you served in J&K, and we often talk about the relevance of strategic communication when we talk either about low-intensity conflict or about terrorism per se. And my sense is that in India, neither the state at the institutional level, I mean, you just have to remember Uri and Pathankot, about this complete lack of strategic communication, and more recently, you know, the way you characterized some of the responses in Indian television. So is there a case to look at Stratcom and introduce it into the system? I mean, does the army have it? How would you sort of, again, characterize this?
The requirement and the necessity, the importance, absolutely. There cannot be any debate on that issue. Have they done it? I would say partially. It's been quite a few years, and I think if you look at it, Kargil probably was the benchmark when this realization really dawned. And given the standards of evolution of the system, things happened at a fairly acceptable level at that time.
But Kargil was 1999.
Exactly.
Now we are 2017.
That's exactly my point. That from there to now, if you look at it today, the kind of evolution which should have taken place, I don't think it has taken place, and there are a couple of reasons for it. One is any service which is by nature, or any organization which is by nature not comfortable with disseminating information, it requires a complete change of its psychology to be able to do it.
Mindset change.
Yes. So I think firstly there is a mindset issue in terms of the desire to disseminate information. The second thing which is related to it is, I think people still haven't understood the power of being able to disseminate that information and the power that it gives you in terms of strategic communication. Your ability to use the wherewithal at your disposal seems to be receding. And what is going to fill that gap is the kind of information you can disseminate to have the impact on on either side of the spectrum, whether it's the adversary or your own people. And I think that realization doesn't seem to have still come about in the government circles.
Maybe you have go ahead.
The third thing, of course, is in terms of people trained to do it. And I think that while we have information warfare as a subject which is getting taught, there are people who are trained and positioned, but I still feel that there's a huge gap between the capability that they bring to the table, the continuity that they seem to be having over a period of time, and the requirements of the medium as it is evolving. I think there is a gap there which they've not been able to bridge.
I think, you just spelt out the equivalent of a policy brief. I hope you'll work on it and
If I may just quickly butt in, I think there's also something simpler, which is that our institutions are remarkably averse to being caught out in any kind of mistake. And in a live information scenario, occasionally you will be caught in a situation where maybe the news is not good news or does not cast you in a flattering light. So in the recent Pathankot case, for example, we were all over TV with official spokespersons saying that 6 militants had been killed.
Neutralized.
We now know from the NIA's investigation that there were in fact only 4 over there, which raises certain questions. Now, the fact of the matter is that no officer or no high official is going to like to be told that, look, you made a mistake. But in the long term, by telling the truth, the institution's credibility is developed. And a government has to realize that this is not about the goals you score today. It's about institution building and the credibility of institution building
in the long
over
term.
A period of
But
time.
actually, I agree. Both Uri and Pathankot, I think, merit a lot of introspection. But I'll come back to that. Sharazad, I want to bring you in on another issue. We spoke about the media. Now, you have roots in the Maghreb, and you're familiar with the last couple of years plus, ever since we had the Islamic State. How would you, as again someone who knows that part of the world, characterize the interface between the media, both print and the audiovisual, and even cyber, considering the Islamic State itself uses the cyber platform, I would say, reasonably effectively? What is your read on this, media and the Islamic State?
Well, I feel that what's dramatic here is for people, youth from the Maghreb, that's quite disenchanted with media. They don't see themselves in the media, but see themselves more in the propaganda of something like the Islamic States. That proves that there is a problem in representation in mainstream media and in the way they're portrayed. And that's why, for example, if we look at the UK and the way it did it, while romanticization is not useful, it treated this man as more human and did not make his identity as a Muslim reduced to just that. So that's, I think, what the youth of the Maghreb would like more, that their identity needs to be taken into account in a more complex way and not relegated to just that, where they're from or their religion, but also a social identity and the fact that they have needs like the rest of the population.
So in a more empathetic manner?
In a more empathetic manner, in a more human manner. For example, in France, in the news, you would talk about people from the Maghreb only when there's an attack, only when there is some troubles in the banlieue, but very rarely in a positive light, apart if they score goals for the French team of football. But there's a gap there, and it's almost as if ISIS fills it. And that's what's dramatic, that they can't recognize themselves in normal media, but in the propaganda at the state. And this needs to change.
Vivek, on the Islamic State, now there's a lot of concern in India, very often, and I think, over the last couple of days, some mainstream newspapers, including yours, Praveen, have drawn attention to the Islamic State. I think today's report spoke about Kozhikode and the sense that there was a small cell there. Now, how serious is the Islamic State and its ideology for Indian security? And how large is the footprint? And I'll come back to you also, Praveen, on that. So you as an analyst, someone who's studying this very closely, how would you characterize the Islamic State and India's internal security? I
have a feeling that this actually often tends to get exaggerated at least in the Indian context, because the manner in which the threat has manifested in a number of countries, especially Europe or even Central Asia, West Asia, I don't think it's a fair comparison to look at India in a similar light. While there have been volunteers who've gone from here, if you were to look at the numbers, it's a minuscule comparison, especially given the context of the population of India. Similarly, in terms of the impact that they've had, if you look at the kind of attacks which have been perpetuated, I again feel there is no comparison with what has happened elsewhere. But having said that, I think there is a context in which it needs to be seen, which needs to be flagged, and that is that here is a perpetuator who may not be what is classically called a lone wolf, but somebody who has been goaded, assisted or facilitated to undertake a terror strike. As Praveen had said, the terror strikes may not be very high on quality or in terms of the impact that they have as may be desirable, but the fact remains that the very idea of somebody being able to perpetuate a terror act who's not necessarily on the radar of the security agencies, in this particular case some of them have been, but let us say if they had not been, that raises another kind of threat for the intelligence agencies and the security forces, and if it was to manifest further, given the kind of social divisions that could possibly be exploited, I think that's something, at least in the future, that we need to look at carefully.
Praveen, I want you to come in on this, the Islamic State and its ideology, meaning that the ideology itself is not new. It's not ab initio. If I remember right, you wrote a piece about this saying that you can go back into the medieval period also to look at this kind of a thinking. But for India, now the anxiety about the train attack recently, which was ostensibly foiled by the security forces, how serious is this footprint? And I'm talking not about India alone, but also Bangladesh, meaning that this is an extended region which could be affected by this idea. Because, you know, Vivek, this numbers issue, I often say, it doesn't matter whether it's 4 people or 400. If they're able to blow up a train and kill large numbers, you know, they serve that purpose. So then the state has abdicated. But Praveen, how would you characterize this?
So, as a way of comparison, if we look at the most successful urban terror campaign this country has ever had, the Indian Mujahideen, in which over 700 Indian nationals were killed from beginning to end, the total number of perpetrators, supporters, everyone put together was less than 100 people, of whom maybe a dozen had received any kind of training at Lashkar-e-Taiba and Jaish-e-Mohammed camps. So that's an indication of how few people can create how much havoc, and that's, I think, a benchmark number. Now, if what we're talking about is the rise of the Islamic State as an organization, as an institution, something we should worry about tremendously? Probably not. There are other organizations like the Lashkar-e-Taiba, which mean India harm, that have significantly greater resources, and you know that could mean that could cause greater havoc. But what's worrying is indeed the way in which the Islamic State has fired the imagination of a section of young Indian Muslims, a section that is very small and peripheral, but nonetheless a not trivial section, who feel angry with the country
and alienated
for a variety of reasons. And
that's
we've seen these small numbers of modules crop up. Sure, they're not well trained. They're not particularly well put together.
But they can be lethal. I think we'll have to
lethal.
come back to this because of the complexity. But at the end of the day, as our discussion has highlighted, the London terror attack raises a number of questions. The primary one is about the evolving profile of terrorism that challenges both state and society. Is it the equivalent of the individual perpetrator being enabled and on occasion catalyzed by social media and its variants? What is the appropriate medium for the mass media, particularly television, to report acts of terrorism that often focus on soft civilian targets? The ideology now associated with the Islamic State and prior to that with the Al-Qaeda, what is the contour of the most effective and affordable counter-narrative response? Can the moderate but often silent spectrum within every faith be encouraged to condemn the distortions that advocate violence? And when we relate all these strands to the Indian security compulsion, what is the way ahead? A measured response that is the right mix of the tactical To prevent such occurrences, and the more long-term or strategic, which will seek to quarantine and address the motivational aspects of terrorist-related violence, are called for. South Asia is an attractive demography for the advocates of the radical Islamist ideologies that have their genesis in the Salafi Wahhabi distortions that have taken root in some constituencies. Nurturing societal empathy in a diverse polity is imperative, and India remains a historical buffer in containing socio-political turbulence. It appears that the current manifestation of globalization and the resurgence of emotive right-wing nationalism is throwing up new challenges in the security domain. London is the most recent example. Alas, it may not be the last. But the abiding challenge is to retain the liberal democratic rhythm in state and society and ensure that equity in the individual context is neither permanently compromised nor transgressed in the pursuit of collective security. On that note, allow me to thank my guests, Mr. Praveen Swami, Ms. Sharzad Dua, and Colonel Vivek Chadha. And thank you for watching Security Scan. Goodbye.